Welcome to the third of the lecture series organized by the Northeast India Audiovisual Archive, Nodal Center of Bhandari Government College. First and foremost, I, on behalf of the team, would like to welcome our resource person for the day, Dr. Henry William Westerman. Thank you for giving us your time. I would also like to welcome our principal and patron, Dr. D. Purohit, and ADMF, Mrs. Doma Lhamu Zimba. We also extend our welcome to HODs and faculties from our college and other guests joining us today. As we begin, I would like to request our principal, sir, to welcome our guest by offering him khada.
So it's a formal welcome, and this is the customary.
Thank you, sir. The Northeast India Audiovisual Archive is a public audiovisual archive located in Department of Mass Media of St. Anthony's College in Shillong. Established in 2019, the archive is supported by the Sasakawa East Foundation, Japan. The endeavors of the archive are aligned with its goal to record and preserve memories and legacies through its collection and conservation of audiovisual materials of different communities in the Northeast. Northeast India Audiovisual Archive Nodal Center of Bahadur Bhandari Government College was established after a memorandum of understanding was signed between the two institutes on 7th February 2023. Bahadur Bhandari Government College is the first nodal center to be established by the archive and acts as an access point for all students and interested scholars to the treasury of audiovisual materials that Northeast India Audiovisual Archive has amassed over time. Northeast India Audiovisual Archive and its nodal centers encourage interested students in documenting various narratives of the region and welcome students already involved in research and documentation to engage with the audience.
I would now like to request our college principal, Dr. D. Purohit, to kindly share a few words.
So, at the outset, I welcome everybody. Good morning, one and all. So, Dr. William Westerman, I welcome you to our campus, and I hope your stint here will be a very good one. Dr. Sarah, you are also welcome because you have already. Okay, Mr. Sarah, whatever. Now, Mr. Sarah, you are also welcome because you are not new to this place. And you have already presented your talks, and we really enjoyed that. So welcome again, both of you. And my dear students, faculty members, and the staff members of Bahadur Bhandari Government College. It's a really proud moment for all of us, especially the NEIAV, for arranging this lecture series. It's a flagship program of NEIAV because you see there are a lot of things here. We are in daily life we are doing that, but we don't want to preserve that. But these archives is one of the things, one of the organization which preserves, which records, and which keeps for the future generations. So that is a very noble thing, and I welcome Dr. Reed and his dynamic team for doing that. So again, we'll be listening to another lecture series. We have already organized 2 lecture series. Before that, for the benefit of our chief resource person, our chief guest, I'd like to tell about our college, sir. Because this college is the premier college of Gangtok. This was established in the year 1977, and from that time it has grown from strength to strength. We have started with a very noble way, with very few people, few hundred students, but now we can boast of 4,000 students with 23 UG departments and 8 PG departments. Our campus spread across 21 acres, and it is in the heart of the town, and it is on the site of the North National Highway. It's a very beautiful campus. We call it a green campus, and we have got all the amenities what you can look for. So this is one of the best campus in Gangtok, and we are really proud of that. And I hope, sir, if you get time, you can visit our campus. You can visit our library. We have a small center, NEIAV office in the library itself. You can visit that. You can take him along. That is it. Nothing more, because I don't want to be a barrier between you and Professor Westerman, because you people are eager to listen to him, and you are listening to me day in and day out. Okay, मैं तो घर की मुर्गी के बराबर है ना, बाप बराबर. So it's like that. So you listen to me many occasions. You like it, you don't like it, but you have to bear it. You can't help it. So Professor Westerman, the stage is yours, and thank you so much for the NEIAV for giving me this opportunity, giving me this podium.
Thank you, sir. I would now like to ask our coordinator, Dr. Repandi lecturer, to address the questions.
I am extremely grateful to Will that he agreed to deliver a lecture in our humble college. So I am really thankful to Will for being here, and I hope the students make good use of this opportunity and interact with our resource person for the day. I also thank our principal for being here and for being a pillar of support always for the archive. I would just like to say a few things before we go into the lecture proper to talk about the Northeast India Audiovisual Archives. Also with regard to the fact that the archive is basically comprised of 9 student members, and I'm just the coordinator. They are the pillars who hold up the archive and do all the activities. I just kind of supervise. So, and any student who is interested, you are most welcome to be part of the archive as well. So the Nodal Center was opened just a year ago, right? And any interested individual, you can get access to documentaries from all across Northeast, different photographs, visual materials, everything is available. So please make use of the opportunity. You have projects at hand, sociology students, history students. You have different kind of documentaries there. So please explore, do come to the archive, do explore. Forms are available online, as well as you can just write a simple application to me, addressed to me, and you will get access to all the materials at the Audiovisual Archive. The Mother Center is at Northeast India Audiovisual Archive, Shillong, St. Anthony's College, right? So you need to understand that this is just a nodal center. It's just an access point for all students as well as interested research scholars to get access to the materials which the archive houses. To go into the nodal center activities in the past few years, past year, we have had lecture series. We have also this year we've had a collaboration with the Mother Center at Shillong. The exhibition was called Legacy Threads, and unfortunately our immediate students couldn't go because they had either CUT exams or the first sessional that was there. But we were able to send 2 participants who were there in the lecture clan stories, and they got full scholarship, full paid sponsorship to stay, to travel, and it was a good exposure trip for them. They could interact with different people from different parts of Northeast, and the lecture clan story, which was one of the major projects last year for Northeast India Archive Nodal Center, got a round of applause during the exhibition and was really well received. So these opportunities will keep coming up. What we did as a Nodal Center was to make sure that the audio material and interactive exhibition was up, and audio material through the QR code was available. Whatever we had recorded as a Nodal Center, we will make it available to the visitors there. And also, it was done in the form of clan comics. So the comics were also visible, as well as they could listen to the audio materials and look at the comics simultaneously while visiting the exhibition. So, as far as the collections are concerned, there are about 963 documentaries, 8 restricted AV materials and 326 films up for grabs for you all, those who want to access it. So it's made available to you all. It's there at the archive. You just need to fill up a simple form, available, like I said, online, as well as a simple application if you cannot access the form. We definitely are encouraging knowledge exchange and trying to tap into the potential for research in Sikkim. As far as the lecture class story, the first project is concerned, where we have collaborated with other organizations. We have 29 audio recordings of the clan stories, the oral narratives of the lectures. We have 16 which are now copyrighted. We are working towards copyright of other audiovisual materials as well, and video recordings of the workshop that was conducted in order to bring out these clan stories. Current projects, as you all know, your college is very old, and in another 3 years is approaching its golden jubilee. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to collect oral histories of the locality in and around the college. We have already done a number of interviews with old shops and shopkeepers, and we are also now conducting interviews with alumni and old faculty members who are currently with us in order to capture the oral history of the college. We are trying to tap into the intangible heritage which is there. So hopefully we will have an exhibition at the end of during the Golden Jubilee celebration. Of course, a minor project that is also being conducted by the students is trying to record the variation of the Lingesar epic, which survives in lecture language. So this is again one minor project that is going on. And of course, we are trying to curate and collect old photographs of the campus, of different events that has happened in the past in the college in the past 50 years, in order to bring out an exhibition of those photographs. So till now, our students have conducted 9 interviews with faculty members, alumni as well, and we will continue this for the next 2 years till the exhibition. So this is one of the contribution of the photographs by Dr. Chanchal Das, who is from chemistry department, and I just coaxed them to kind of see how the cherry trees line the college area, and just use the AI to kind of see how it used to look like. So they did a brilliant job with this, and if you can see that the library doesn't exist at that point of time. This is 2002, right? And this is the entryway of the college, right? And you can't see the gate, but you can see the road, which is not pitched properly. So just imagine the amount of change that has happened across the years. So we're trying to capture all those memories through curating as well as collecting old photographs of the college. This is just an example. Hopefully we'll get more contributions from faculties as well as alumni to be able to actually hold a proper exhibition of all these photographs in the future. So definitely invite all of you, if you have, I'm sure some of your family members have been an alumni in this college. So please encourage them to kind of contribute photographs, or if they would like to give an interview, we'd be happy to conduct one, to talk about the college, their memories, to revive memories, to refresh the memories of their college days. So please do visit the Instagram page as well as Facebook page of the archive, and do get in touch with us if you have any valuable memento of the college that you would like to contribute. And of course, the copyright will be with you. So don't worry, that we'll not take it away. It will be with you. We'll just digitize the material. So with that, that's all I wanted to say about the archive and what we have been doing in the past. So thank you all for being here, and I hope you do have good questions for Bill at the end of the lecture. Do interact with him. You don't get these opportunities very often. So please make use of this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. We now proceed with a brief introduction of the resource person facilitating today's lecture. Our guest speaker is a current Fulbright-Nehru scholar in the Department of Cultural and Creative Studies at Northeastern Hill University in Shillong. He is Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work, and coordinator of the program in Ethnic and Immigration Studies at New Jersey City University.
I just want to thank Dr. Ripandi Lepcha for the invitation to be with you today, and for the great hospitality and all the assistance you've provided me here in Gangtok. It's an absolutely beautiful city. It's my first time here. We figured out in the taxi on the way over, it's my 7th time in the Northeast, mostly in the 7 states of the Northeast. It's my first time in Sikkim. And it's just a tremendous honor to be here, and I hope that this is the first of many visits, and that I'll be invited back even after today's lecture, if it goes well. I'm going to speak very informally today. I'm going to show you some photos from exhibits that I've worked on and museums where I've worked. And I'm also going to show you some photos from exhibits that I visited, some that I had no connection with, and a couple where I knew some of the organizers. And I'm really interested in the question of how archives and museums can be more involved in their communities, and how communities can be more involved in their archives and museums. You know, historically, I think we have this image of archives and museums as being very distant places, very dusty places where artifacts go to die. And there is a worldwide movement, I would say, and it's really spearheaded by groups all around the world, including indigenous scholars and groups, looking at how museums can become a much more important part of the community. And that goes for archives as well. I mean, what happens to an oral history collection? What happens to an oral history project after the recordings are made and it's filed away? I'm actually in the middle of working on an oral history project in Jersey City, which is the city where my university is located. And our historical society is launching an oral history project that I'm one of the lead researchers on, looking at the history of a city that has changed dramatically over the last 25 years in particular. It's a city of immigrants. It's a colonial city that dates back to the 1600s. It's a city that is rapidly gentrifying, if you're familiar with the sociologists are familiar with that term, that low-income people are being pushed out as wealthy real estate developers are moving in and building expensive housing. So in this moment of change, I think oral historians are always interested in these moments of change and recording what has come before it's lost. But then what do we do with it, right? Then how do we involve students and how do we involve the community in addressing these issues and taking some kind of action? As you have heard from my introduction, I've been a community activist. I've been involved in human services, and I'm involved in local projects at my university to try to take the knowledge that we gain from our studies and from our research and to apply them to address social issues and social problems. We can go to the first slide, I think. So some of you may be familiar with this. This is from the Nagaland State Museum in Kohima. And this is a very traditional format, a very traditional government museum. You will walk through, and I've been to some state museums in Tamil Nadu, and I've been to the Don Bosco Museum in Meghalaya. And in very traditional museums, you'll have artifacts on the walls, you'll have artifacts behind glass cases or plexiglass cases. And as often as not, you'll have very little interpretation. You'll have very little educational material on the wall. And the next slide, please. Sometimes you'll have very attractive displays of artifacts, but they are what we would say decontextualized. They are taken out of their community, and the meaning, the significance that these objects served within the community is not part of the exhibit necessarily. It may be lost. This is again where oral history comes in, where you would like to have research associated with this so that a visitor can understand not just how this appears visually, but how the artifacts may have been used and the significance to the people who used them, as well as the significance to the people who made them. This can be done with digital technology and with Cell phones, this is yet another powerful use of cell phone technology, that it is very accessible now and very inexpensive for museums and archives to upload informational material, either text or actual excerpts from oral history interviews, into coded files that can be accessed by QR code or can be accessed by punching in an access number. And museums are moving more towards this, so that instead of having to rent cumbersome equipment, everybody's coming to the museum, they have their mobile phone, and they can use that to learn as much or as little as they would like about the artifacts. This is from the Gandhi Memorial Museum in Delhi, and it's kind of flat, not uninteresting, but museums are not heavily trafficked, populated places. You have to go there and you have to do the work yourself, doing all the reading from the text. And the challenge, as I said, is how do we make museums alive and relevant? So there's a long history in museums of collecting. And the origins of museums, some of the origins of European museums and American museums, were to basically show off the property, show off the collections of wealthy collectors and wealthy donors. There's an art historian by the name of John Berger. Some of you may have come across him either in art history or in sociology classes. He was a real Renaissance man of the 21st centuries. He was a novelist, he was a poet, he was a painter, an art historian, and a sociologist. He produced in the early 1970s a landmark television series called Ways of Seeing, which challenged the notion of museums and challenged the notion of the way that art historians look at art, to start asking sociological questions and political questions about the art and about the places where art was displayed. He also, very significantly, I show this in my class, decoded advertising and oil painting, particularly in the male depiction of women, and what became known as the male gaze. Some of you may have heard of this, G-A-Z-E, the gaze, the idea that those with power, whether they are men looking at women, whether they are scholars looking at people in the field, that the person who is doing the viewing has all the power, and the person who is the object of that viewing is diminished, is objectified. He was one of the first people to identify this trend in arts and in museums. And he really took to task museums that were established for the purpose of glorifying the wealth and status of the collectors that brought the materials together. One of the museums that would fall into this category is the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, a very famous museum that was established by one of the members of the Rockefeller family. So it had big money behind it. And one could critique it and say that part of the purpose was to add value to the works that were shown. If your work was shown in the Museum of Modern Art, as an artist, your art took on, your material took on greater cachet and greater value. So it had a commercial purpose as well. And MoMA, as it's known, has actually, I'd say in the past decade, 10, 15, 20 years, has really started to examine its role in New York City and its role in the culture, and has actually followed one of John Berger's recommendations, which is that rather than establishing museums as repositories of valuable artifacts, they can be used as educational spaces to teach about the artistic process and to look at how artists struggle with ideas, struggle with form, and solve the creative problems that they face as artists. Berger suggested in a very important essay that we shouldn't just look at the most outstanding works of art or the most valuable works of art, but we should look at works of art that are historically significant. We should take into account works of art that don't quite succeed, that remain mediocre, and look at what it is that makes for greatness and importance, historical importance and social significance in the arts. This has finally taken hold in a number of museums, and this is a poster from an exhibit from 2022, from 2 years ago. And this was an exhibit about the French artist Henri Matisse, in which the curators recreated his studio. This painting in particular, called the Red Studio, was a painting that Matisse did of his own studio and all the works that were in the studio at the time, which was about 1910. And then the works were sold off to various collectors and museums. And MoMA actually managed to bring together all but one of the pieces that were in the original studio and exhibit them together as they had existed in his studio, frozen in time in the painting. The one painting that was inaccessible was one that he actually asked to be destroyed after his death. So this is rewriting the narrative, is what I'm suggesting here. Instead of saying, oh, these are great works of art, let's bow down in front of them, let's admire them, the questions were, let's look at his artistic process, what he considered to be, how he developed work that he considered to be successful, how he rewrote and reworked and worked through drafts and revisions of his work. One of the astonishing discoveries that the curators made when they looked at this painting and did X-ray photography was that this was a painting that had gone through several drafts, and it was only in the last version that he decided to paint the whole background red. That if we were able to, when they were able to look behind the red paint, they saw that he had gone through a process of drawing and revising and repainting and finally coming up with this very bold red color statement. So instead of looking at art as just products, museums such as this are now looking at the artistic process. And that's a very significant change in the way that we approach museums and curating. Next slide. MoMA has also been incorporating some collaborative works. This was from a series, an installation of fishing nets. And this artist, Carolina Caicedo, went to Oaxaca, Mexico. It's a coastal state, and worked with local fishermen and fisherwomen, who were making their own nets. And together, she collected oral histories about the fishing industry in that state, in Oaxaca. And the words, the testimonies of these, the fishermen, men who typically went out and did the fishing, and the women who stayed on the shore and worked with the nets and worked with the catch when it came in. The words of their testimonies, the words of their oral histories, were part of the exhibit as well. And then the artist took these nets, I should say the final artist, Caicedo, took these nets, recognizing the artistic and technical expertise of net weaving, which modern art museums and museums typically have not considered to be art before. And then she used coloring, dyes, and mounted them from the ceiling in these spectacular displays of movement, so that the nets were free to kind of twirl. So it was really a multi-dimensional piece. You had the craft of the net making, you had the coloring and the installation that Caicedo had provided, and then you had the oral histories on the wall. I think I have another slide from this as well. Yeah. And these are massive. This is in a room that must be, I would say, probably 20, 30 meters high. Now this is from a museum in Chicago that I was the director of. I had the great privilege of being the director, first permanent director of this museum. And this was a history museum that was established by the Cambodian refugee community in Chicago. You may know that in the 1970s there was a genocide that took place in Cambodia from 1975 to 1978. A militant group called the Khmer Rouge took over the country, and they were an extremist Maoist armed political group that believed in absolute equality and that no elites of any kind should be permitted to survive or to be superior to anyone else. So anyone who was a doctor, anyone who had an education, was immediately suspect and could be killed. And the entire country was shut down and turned into rural labor camps where everybody was supposed to be working in an egalitarian, completely classless society. And in the course of the 4 years of their reign, they killed outright somewhere around 1 million people, 1 million to 1.5 million people, and as many as another 1 million died of starvation after they were overthrown in 1979. I should also provide a little bit of context here, which is the fact that this was taking place on the heels of the US war in Southeast Asia and in Vietnam. And as the US expanded that war effort, the US bombed, Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, you may have heard of, bombed Cambodia, dropped greater tonnage of bombs on Cambodia than on Vietnam. In fact, Cambodia was bombed more heavily than Japan was during the Second World War. And as many as 750,000 people were killed in 5 years of that bombing campaign, which is what led to the formation of the Khmer Rouge and the military overthrow of the US-backed regime, which then set off the genocide. So in total, between 1970 and 1982, about 2.5 to 3 million of Cambodia's 11 million population perished. The significance of this is that the U.S. accepted about 150,000 Cambodian refugees after this period, as well as about 350,000 Vietnamese refugees, another 50,000 Laotian refugees. And the Cambodian communities, I had started by working with the Cambodian community in Philadelphia, and was invited to Chicago because the Cambodian community in Chicago was starting a memorial museum of their own. There were 3 parts to this museum, are 3 parts to the museum. The first is exhibits on the Cambodian genocide and on Cambodian culture. The second part was an archive, a library and archive of oral histories of survivors, and books and articles about the Cambodian genocide, all in one place for scholars and researchers. And this was significant. The archival research was significant, and the oral history research was significant because people had been so traumatized that they didn't want to talk about it anymore. And their US-born children and grandchildren didn't know anything about the history because their parents and grandparents were not speaking about it at all. And so the museum saw itself as a place that could open up this dialogue, and that elders who would be willing to talk could record the history so that future generations would know how they got to America and what their ancestors had survived and had gone through. The third part, which is very unconventional for a museum, is this memorial section. And the names of people who were killed by the Khmer Rouge were etched into these glass panels. And this was used as an altar, as a shrine, for memorial ceremonies. And we regularly had groups of elders, and we also had groups of visiting scholars and visitors from Cambodia come and pray at the memorial. So that it wasn't just a walking exhibit that you go in and you see what's on the walls and you are intellectually informed, but we addressed the spiritual needs and the emotional needs of the population. And the next slide shows actually one of the memorial ceremonies. The gentleman on the right is Kompaz Set, who was the founder of the museum and the director of the Cambodian Association and a Buddhist scholar, scholar of Cambodian Buddhism, and one of the most remarkable people I've ever met in my life, and a great community leader. There are other ways that exhibits can take place, very informal and very inexpensively. I'm going to show you 2 exhibits from Bangladesh right now. I don't know if you've heard of a photography festival that takes place every 2 years in Dhaka called Chobi Mela. It is the largest photography festival in Asia, and there tends to be a focus on documentary photography and installations all over Dhaka, and very genuine pop-ups, very inexpensive ways of getting the art out to the people. So this is an exhibit, this is an outdoor photography exhibit, and you can see that the materials are as inexpensive as can be. And the next slide shows how we have what we call traveling exhibits that go from museum to museum. This is a genuine traveling exhibit where the photographs were mounted on these whiteboards and pedaled around, bicycled around the city, bringing the images and bringing the photography exhibit directly to the people. So the first part of my talk, these are some of the main points that I want to get across. That we are moving away from property accumulation and what we can call colonial extraction, where museum curators and museum owners and gallery owners and wealthy collectors would go into particularly indigenous communities and take artifacts and bring them back to places like the British Museum and the Smithsonian Institution. Very often indigenous communities were plundered, were looted. There are issues of human remains that were actually taken for scientific museums and historical museums. And there are movements around the world now to repatriate those remains and those artifacts back to the people that they originally belonged to. We're moving towards thinking of exhibits as a process, thinking of art as a process, and using museums as spaces to interpret aesthetics, the study of art, what makes something artistic, technique, meaning, and ethics. We're also now moving more into a time of community involvement in exhibit design and interpretation, so that it's not just professional curators, but as we've seen, for example, from the archive here and the students that are working in the archive here, the community members can be more involved in actually setting the direction. This was equally true in the Cambodian Museum where I worked. We had a community advisory board they were developing the educational curriculum. They were suggesting what exhibits were important to them. So collaboration, both in interpretation and, as we saw with the example of the fishing nets, collaboration between craftspeople and artists, between workers and artists and curators, and then these alternative formats, and spaces for exhibits. And this is just an example from the Cambodian Association, Cambodian Museum, their education committee, and some of the plans that they're outlining for how to improve the educational impact that the museum has. And museum education, which I'm going to talk about in the second half of my talk, museum education is really has been undervalued and under-resourced. So as I talked about in the beginning with the state museums, there's very little active education going on. Schools may be brought in for a quick tour, at least this is what happens in the US. And a museum can say, yes, we had 60,000 students come through last year. But the depth of experience may be lacking. So museums are turning more towards thinking with intentionality about how to have more impact on the community and how to have more of an educational impact. Next slide. Another example is social engagement in the arts. And I gave an example of this with the fishing nets. This is an example from a colleague of mine, friend of mine, who's at a university in Chicago called Columbia College Chicago. It's an art university. And she is a craft artist and a specialist in paper making. And what she has done in Chicago, as well as in Kyrgyzstan and in Georgia and in Serbia and Croatia, has been working with gardeners and with women who work with different plant materials and different flower materials to create alternative fibers and sustainable fibers in developing different kinds of paper. And so this is part of what is called, what's come to be called social practice art, which is that, again, it's not just about the beauty of the object itself, but it's about how the object is used, utilitarian arts, crafts, and the social meaning that goes into the creation and the social meaning that is derived from the use of these materials. So her work is very much involved with sustainable gardening and sustainable craft making, sustainable paper making. It goes beyond just recycling to start thinking about what kind of fibers. For example, I mean, a very simple example of this is instead of making papers from old wood forests, hardwood forests and clear-cutting forests for making paper, paper made from bamboo is much more sustainable, right? Bamboo grows much more rapidly and is much more sustainable. And there are other vegetable crops and herb crops that can be used to generate paper. This is an example of about, 12, 15 of the different kinds of paper that she has made with different plants, and the plants are identified. And there's also a very activist bent, a very activist strand in this kind of work. A number of the artists that were involved in this exhibit saw not only the political potential and the social potential in the craft itself, but also how paper can be used for posters and for political messages. And this is one, assimilation is violence, is so using the idea of the poster or the broadside in an exhibit on paper craft. Some of you may have, this is probably the most famous artist that I'm showing today. You may have heard of Ai Weiwei, a Chinese artist who now has political asylum in the US and has done extensive political work around political repression in China, but also around the persecution of immigrants and refugees around the world, being a refugee himself. And this is actually one of the many media that he works in are traditional media, including Chinese porcelain, and using the motifs and using the pattern of Chinese porcelain, he's done a series of plates on refugees, on conflict and refugees. And this is a refugee camp scene that he's done. And so again, this is a kind of social practice art where his art is explicitly carrying a message, using traditional techniques, but explicitly carrying a very modern message. Exhibits don't need to be, art doesn't need to be a single object, a single artifact. This is part of a series from an exhibit that was in Philadelphia last year called Rising Sun. And I would recommend that you go, that they have an active web, the exhibits come down, but there's an active website. 20 artists were asked to reflect on whether the sun is rising or setting on the United States, given the political moment that we're in. And this is one of the pieces, an excerpt from one of the pieces from that show. This artist, Lenka Clayton, traced a piece of marble, the history of a piece of marble from its archaeological origins in Greece to its entire journey, how it got from Greece and was colonized and brought to the United States, captured and brought to the United States, and all the ways, the history of this block of marble which eventually became sculpted into a duck that was a mascot that was used at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, where this exhibit took place. And so she traces the thousands-year-long history of this block of marble through every manifestation that she could find, from ancient times when the marble was actually, geological times when the marble was actually created, all the way up to its contemporary use and contemporary position in 21st century Philadelphia. And she uses paintings, photographs, drawings along the way, illustrating the history of this block. And the white, which you can't read here, it's too small, but a white narrative that covered the walls of this exhibit in telling this story. So she was in fact curating a mini exhibit within an exhibit of probably about 20 or 30 pieces, telling the history of how this block of marble was colonized, captured, and brought to America, and eventually destroyed. Political art can take many forms. This is another work from the same exhibit. This is actually embroidery. And this artist decided she wanted to illustrate the presence of the US military around the world by the size of the deployment of American military and the form that deployment took, whether it was Army, Navy, Air Force, reconnaissance, intelligence. And so this is, if you can recognize it, this is an excerpt from the Horn of Africa, the northeastern part of the African continent. You can see Somalia. Actually, I'll walk over. So this is Somalia. You have Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, South Sudan. And she's made an infographic, but using embroidery. This is what's so artistically, I think, significant about this, using embroidery in this infographic, and different cloths and different patterns that are also representational of the regions that she is showing. So I'm advocating for this deeper involvement of museums and archives, going beyond the minimal text of interpretation that you might see on the walls, the use of audio and phone technology to make this interpretation more accessible, thinking about education in schools beyond one-time visits. How can you establish a long-term residency? And again, I think the example here is it 9 students that are working in the archive here? That kind of in-depth involvement with students in particular is going to have a lifelong impact. It's not just, you're getting a day out of school and doing a quick tour and forgetting about it, but how do we actually make museums part of the school experience and part of the curriculum of the school as well? In-depth artist residencies. One of the projects, it was mentioned in the introduction that I had worked on, co-authored a book on Cambodian folk opera. That came out of a residency that we had with a Cambodian artist in Philadelphia. And we had a 36-week residency where students studied with him in an after-school program, learning all of the arts associated with all the performing, not just performing arts, all the arts associated with operatic performance in Cambodian folk opera, including costume design, costume sewing, embroidery, makeup, and face paint, the oral stories and the oral literature that made up the opera stories, all the musical instruments that were part of the ensemble that accompanied them, and the performance, the singing and the performance itself. So this one residency that lasted over an entire academic year included visual arts, literary arts, dance and movement arts, and musical arts, both instrumental performance and singing performance. That's what museums can do at their best, I think, in terms of education. It's not just, again, not just going and visiting once, but how do you actually integrate the artistic process into the curriculum experience of students. History and memory, as you know well here, and as Dr. Lepcha spoke earlier, is essential. You can't negate or forget people's memory, people's life experience. It's a tremendous well of culture, of meaning, and of emotional significance. And that has traditionally been lost in museums that are oriented towards an exhibit that is purely visual, without taking into account the deeper meaning that all these artifacts, whether it's a painting or one of the spears that we saw, objects have meaning, and objects have different meanings for the people who created them and used them. So the museum world is starting to expand the definition of what is considered art beyond Western notions of that. Including social practice art, including craft, including things like practices like gardening and cooking and domestic arts, arts that historically have been very gendered. The Western notion of art has been very masculine, without considering food, craft, sewing, gardening, which have been women's arts for millennia. And then lastly, I would say, don't be afraid of activism. That far from being static, exhibits can actually have an impact on the community. And exhibits can be more than just a message, but can actually be integrated into strategies of community organizing and social work. I don't know if there are any social work students here, but if you look at what social workers call macro and meso practice in social work, not just clinical practice, the arts have a tremendous role and exhibits have a tremendous role to play. And I'm going to close with a few slides from an exhibit that I did at the Museum of Chinese in the Americas, which also traveled to the Smithsonian Institution in the US. These were sculptures that were made by detained Chinese immigrants who were trying to come to the US to work. Some of them were coming to escape the crackdown after Tiananmen Square and the pro-democracy movement. They were coming on board a ship that was run by what we would call smugglers. They had paid thousands of dollars to be brought into the U.S. At sea, secretly, clandestinely. And this particular ship crashed. It's a long story, but this particular ship crashed and ran aground in New York City, believe it or not. And there were about 285 immigrants aboard the ship. They were taken into custody by U.S. immigration, and while they applied for political asylum, they were held in jails. Some of them stayed and fought their cases for 4 years. And while they were in the jail, one jail in particular in Pennsylvania, they decided to pass the time by making sculptures out of whatever paper they could find. And over the course of 4 years, they made 10,000 sculptures. We became aware of this. I was working at an organization at the time called the Philadelphia Folklore Project, and we decided to work with the Chinese Museum of Chinese in the Americas and create an exhibit while they were still in prison to try to get them, to try to raise awareness that they were being detained for that long, and even to get them released. And in the end, some of them were released, or the remaining ones were released after the exhibits and after some of the artwork was actually presented to President Bill Clinton at the time. So here's some of the artwork that they made. This is actually a replica of the ship that they came in on, that one of the men made out of paper. Next slide. This is a bird cage that they made to symbolize the persecution that they experienced in China. And if you look carefully, you can see that the artist has actually written the word China in, or not written, but folded paper across the top there, saying China. They used toilet paper that was available to them. They got their visitors were able to donate magic markers, but they used toilet paper and made paper mache out of it and created this dragon. And I'll close with this. Some of them were Buddhists, and so made this kind of sculpture as well. So, as I said, they ended up getting released. Some of them got political asylum. Some of them actually got visas as artists to continue to practice their arts. And it was through the exhibit and through the museum not being afraid to take on a social issue at that time that this had an impact far beyond the walls of the exhibit. And now, 25 years later, I'm still actually in touch with several of them who have been settled all around the United States. Unfortunately, I should also say as a footnote that the detention of immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers not only has expanded way beyond what that was, excuse me, at the time, it's become a multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States, with about 40,000 immigrants detained, imprisoned at any given time. But also Australia has made extensive use of immigration detention. The UK, and you may have even heard that now to discourage asylum seekers, the UK is going to be shipping asylum seekers off to Rwanda for offshore processing. And Australia's done the same with Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. They've sent the would-be asylum seekers there. So in some ways we won the battle but lost the war. But it shows what, in microcosm, would this be considered to be fine art by a fine art museum? Probably not. This is definitely folk art. But it was art that had meaning and spoke to a particular moment in time and the particular anguish of the artists who found themselves in this situation. So think big, think broadly, think about education, and lastly, think about museums as community spaces. We think of museums as cloistered archives, as I said, where oral histories go, where paintings go, where things are in storage. But they are also spaces where people can come together. And they're probably the only spaces, other than schools, where people can come together and actually have cultural conversations, and sometimes very difficult conversations about social issues that are significant to them. Conversations about racism, conversations about sexism, conversations about economic inequality. And because they are cultural spaces, because they are curated spaces, they can be safer spaces for having some of these difficult conversations that it's very hard to have in other venues or very hard to have in our society. So I advocate for museums and for museum education programs in particular as being places where people can come together to learn about history, to learn about culture, and to learn about art, but also to learn from one another, to learn about listening, to learn about creativity, to learn about ingenuity in problem solving, to learn about memory and history, and to start to think about how we move forward in making our society more sustainable, more habitable, and more hospitable for all of us. So thank you for your time. I'm happy to take questions and continue the conversation.
Thank you, sir, for your insightful lecture. The floor is now open for questions and discussion. Anyone really wishing to pose a question or a comment may raise their hands, and a microphone will be made available for them.
sir, for such an insightful dialogue. I think the idea is very novel for making museums an interactive space. But at the same time, apart from the artifacts, the museum as a whole, the space, I'm also from sociology, so talking from the viewpoint of sociology of spaces, it emits an energy which says there are very pristine, important things here. So you must respect these artifacts with silence. And if you notice, there are no benches ever in a museum. So a person is not allowed to spend more than a few seconds or few minutes and pass on to the next thing. So I feel the museums have always been a space which emits bourgeois energy, if that is allowed, because you have to be of a certain class and of a certain behavior inside that space, which controls your interaction with the artifact. Forget about the context. Context is like, as you said, detached, and we can only see the artifact and maybe perhaps imagine if we have the background information about what the artifact is, and then just proceed. So your idea, as you have proposed, I really would want to be implemented in all the museums, but how do we do it with all that other things that the museum is?
It's a really great point and a really great question. I think about, speaking of sociology, I think about Irving Goffman and the concept of frames. And Goffman was a sociologist who basically outlined, if I'm doing it justice, that we all live within certain frameworks. We all live within certain kind of dramatic conventions and theatrical conventions. And what I'm advocating is what he would call breaking the frame, right? You have these very bourgeois, pristine, unfriendly spaces. How do you think as a curator, how do you think as an education director, let's break that space down. Let's put a bunch of chairs, let's put a bunch of pillows, whatever. And I mean, this is also an architectural problem, right? Because many of these institutions are built in these very kind of lofty, you feel small when you go into, you go into the New York Public Library, you go into the Metropolitan, you go into even the Kohima State Museum. They're big spaces. So how do you take how do you find alternative spaces, or how do you break that frame down so that it's not so intimidating, not so bourgeois? And again, this is where I think schools play a big role. And again, if you're taking your students in like it's a cathedral, that kids are going to grow up to think, yeah, this is a place where I go and worship and I don't interact. So education departments, and I don't know if education departments are a thing here in India, but they're really understaffed and under-resourced. So getting a generation of museum educators and archival educators to think about how are we going to really make this space friendlier, more accessible. And that's a challenge. That's a huge challenge, especially with very elite institutions that have a lot of money, compared to more like startup, like as I mentioned, the Philadelphia Folklore Project or even the Cambodian Museum, smaller spaces. I mean, the Cambodian Museum is a good example. There was a Cambodian association. It was a social service self-help organization for refugees, by refugees. And they had a little piece of land next to their building that they owned. And they had the idea, let's raise money and build a new wing and create our own museum. So without relying on a massive institution, they did it from the bottom up. So much good social change happens from the bottom up. It's a challenge for community organizers and for artists to think creatively about how, and as I said, my friend Melissa Potter, she works in gardens, right? You can't have a space that's more earthy, more down to earth than an actual garden. I'm really calling on us to think very creatively and very to really challenge the architectural authority and architectural dominance. And it's not an easy, none of these cultural battles are easy, or cultural work, I prefer to call it. That's never going to be easy, but like community organizing, it's done piece by piece, person by person, community by community. But that's a great point, yeah, very important. There was another, I thought I had this slide in here, I must have dropped it, of a barn that had been converted into a museum of farm artifacts. And there was someone who had an old barn, and again, you can't get more down to earth than going into somebody's barn and looking at these handmade metal tools. They are useful, but they're also the craft that goes into creating them is artistic and needs to be recognized as such.
When it comes to setting up a museum, the whole politics of what to showcase and what not, who decides? When it is coming from the community itself, as in the case of the Cambodian immigrants, then it's fine because the community itself is deciding that these are the things that we would like to preserve. Otherwise, in a general, in my country or maybe elsewhere also, when it's like a government-sponsored setting up of museums, there will be people who will be taking this call about what should we be preserving and what should, who assigns the importance or significance to a particular artifact and all this, and how can we actually, challenge this whole, it's making a political statement. A museum is basically directly oriented. So how is it possible for lesser known cultures to actually challenge this whole? I hope I have been able to.
Yeah. In fact, one thing that I left out of this talk, I'm hoping in the time that I have left on my Fulbright, if not this year, I'm going to be back next year for a couple of months. I'm very interested in the village museums in Nagaland, and I don't know if that same thing exists in Sikkim, but many of the villages, from what I can tell, in Nagaland have set up their own village museums. And they're basically spaces, traditional architecture, where they've just collected a lot of artifacts that people just wanted to donate from the community. But one of the things that I want to find out, and I've asked in different villages, I haven't been to that many villages, what are you doing with those artifacts? Two of the villages that I visited didn't even have a volunteer to staff the museum. But this idea of village museums, coming from the village leadership and coming from the people who live in the village, they're not, I don't think they're making an explicit political statement, but they are building something very different from a top-down, government-sponsored, big money-funded museum. And these are political battles. In Jersey City, where my university is, we are having a very challenging time right now. There's a very famous modern art museum in Paris, France, called the Pompidou Center. And they have decided that they want to open up a branch in the United States, in the New York City area, and Jersey City is just across the river from New York City. And there's a lot, as I said, there's a lot of real estate development and gentrification going on, and they've decided they want to have their elite modern art museum right in the center of the transportation hub of one of the downtown areas in Jersey City. And they're going to put millions of dollars into it, and they're asking our local government for millions of dollars to support that. And local people, such as myself, are saying, the government doesn't even have the money to keep my university open, and that's a cultural institution that benefits thousands of students every year, local students, low-income students. I teach at a state university with predominantly working class and low-income students. We have galleries on campus. We don't have the funding to keep, we've been cutting academic programs because we don't have the funding, and now our local government wants to give, I think, $14 million to the Pompidou Center to set up this elite art museum. And what is that going to do? That's going to drive up real estate prices in the whole area, which is part of the point. It's going to bring in a much wealthier class of residents. And it's going to, there's this competition for status, but also for the wealth that's going to generate in real estate. So The real estate developers are really behind it. And if you follow American politics at all, Donald Trump's son-in-law is one of the realtors that's actually building around this development. So a lot of corruption involved as well, because there are certain tax laws that certain spaces in low-income areas have to be reserved for low-income residents. What do you call it? Housing, low-income housing, and he's like totally gotten all around that. And this museum is actually going to have an instrument, if it's built, is going to have an instrumental role in aiding and enriching the real estate class and the developer class. So how do you stop that force? You know, how do we make the case that this is a very real issue for us? How do we make the case at our state university, which is on the other side of town, that, you know, that $14 million would close our operating gap, would close our deficit. And that's benefiting local residents concretely in a way that a museum like that is not going to. So yeah, these are very real political battles happening at every stage of the process. I don't know if I answered your question, but...
So, I've got a question. So artifacts, be it of any sort, social or cultural artifacts, or even religious for that matter, forms a very important part of the historical culture. Now, in your whole lecture on transitioning these museums into some cultural, interactive educational centers, where do you see intangible heritage as a part of it? So I'd like to know about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great curatorial question. Where do I see intangible heritage as being part of that? I mean, there's been such a focus in museums in particular on tangible, and archives, I would say, are dealing more with the intangible cultural heritage, but again, the digital revolution has also enabled us to do more in terms of photographic recording, video recording, and accessing, and then also do we need the four walls of a museum? Or can we have more virtual exhibitions? For someone like me who's not a digital native, I'm not necessarily comfortable seeing an exhibit on my phone, but for those of you that are digital natives, growing up with that, and maybe having that experience more than a brick and mortar architectural, space, that may be the way to go. Maybe the museum concept is obsolescent. Maybe the big museums are going to be less relevant. The small village museums are going to be more relevant, and the virtual museums, the virtual exhibits, particularly as you said, for anything that's using sound and intangible heritage. Again, this generation of digital natives are going to be the first ones to think creatively about how do you make that accessible, how do you do interpretation, how do you do education, how do you keep people's attention. You know how hard it is when you're on the phone to stay focused on one thing at a time. Is that range of, let me just see if I got an email while I was looking at this exhibit, is that going to affect the way that we process knowledge and information and ideas as presented through a cultural website or a cultural portal? So I think that's a great question for the future as well. I teach a course called Visual Sociology, and I point out to my students that before the first, does anybody know what year? I can turn. What year cameras were introduced to cell phones? It was 2004. And think about how that has changed everything in our society. It has completely changed the field of photography. It is completely thinking ahead, changing the historical photographic record we're going to have at the time. And that's a hard break between before 2004 and after 2004. This is the first time in human history that most people on the planet are walking around with a camera in their pocket. what that does to the notion of archiving and preserving and interpreting and exhibiting, it's just, it just explodes the whole thing. And sound is no different. I think sound recording is not as prevalent as taking a picture, but probably most of you have a recording app, and you can record an interview, you can record a lecture, you can record a family conversation. I had a student, I'll just mention this, I had a student for her final project, very sensitive topic. She had survived a very violent, abusive relationship. And she decided for her final project for my class to have a conversation and interview her parents about what they were thinking and how they were reacting when they knew that she was in this relationship that she couldn't get out of. And so she sat down and had an interview with her parents and then played that excerpts from that for the class. That's a piece of intangible oral history generated by a survivor that, if she takes care of it, can be shared for years. That's never existed before to the same extent it exists now. And so, I mention it because it's so personal and so intimate. Would that ever be part of an archive? Would it ever be part of a museum? And then would there be the permission? We talked about this a little bit before the program. Some indigenous communities are extremely protective about their oral traditions and their intangible heritage being shared outside of the community. And there are many stories of anthropologists and curators that have not only violated in terms of collecting things they shouldn't have collected in unscrupulous ways that they shouldn't have done so, but then exhibited things that they should never have exhibited to the outside public. That can only become an even greater issue as you have more people making their own recordings, their own photographs, and what's going to happen to that material while they're alive and certainly after they're gone. So these conversations need to happen. The technology, no surprise here, the technology is happening much faster than the conversations about them, and the ethics around that.
I just had a brief comment and perhaps a question. Bill, I was wondering, you were talking about, and even Viveka talked about it, that this model is there in terms of how museums are, say, instated. So, talking about indigenous museums, unfortunately, to answer your question, there are museums in the villages. Some of them do have personal archives and museums. But unfortunately, they have not been able to break this colonial hangover of the structure and what goes into the museum, and it's as uninteractive as possible. It's just artifacts at display. So I was wondering whether you would have any suggestions, or could you kind of explicate in terms of anything that is there that could help spread awareness in terms of kind of breaking away from this model and actually easing into more organic kind of development of museum, which is interactive and educative for the people from the community as well as those outside of the community.
Yeah, I don't, in a way. I think that's a task for community activists and maybe community organizers to start that conversation, but without dominating the conversation. I think if there's a field I think we expand social work into thinking about cultural work, which is something that I'm writing about. That needs to happen at an organic level. If you've read Paulo Freire, for example, and his approach to literacy education, his approach to education in general, starting from the bottom up, starting by bringing in life experience, starting with the sense that knowledge building is participatory and it's not a top-down phenomenon. If we carry that, and there are people that have done this, but if we carry that into the arts and into museums and archives, it's not telling people you have to be decolonial, but that's a change that's going to happen over time. It's going to be a generational change. It's going to be taking this awareness of being in a post-colonial context and thinking, okay, how do we carry this out? You know, I don't think that, and no disrespect to elders, but I don't think elders, such as myself, are in a position to say, all right, this is how it's going to change. But I think getting young people involved in village museums, for example. The challenge is there that you have the pressures of global capitalism, you have the pressures of people leaving their culture, this is a huge issue in language preservation and language regeneration. You have many people who don't see an economic importance to maintaining their language and maintaining their culture. You know, these are just dead things. Why do we need to have this museum? Why do we need to even have these artifacts? I want to move to the city and make a good income. I mean, capitalism, global capitalism is a tremendously, as everyone knows here, tremendously powerful, hegemonic, dominant force that's changing everything from restaurants to foodways to gardening practices. I like to say my students don't know where their food comes from. They're not gardeners. Their grandparents may have been if they came from the southern states or they're immigrants. So it's going to take a generation of young cultural activists, I think, to sit down with elders and learn from elders and dialogue with elders. I don't think it can happen from the outside, but I think there can be catalysts, and I think there can be ideas and readings, hopefully, and speakers and dialogue that can start. But I think every community is going to have to come up with its own solution.
Just a comment, observation. Also, that there is prevailing, inequality in terms of how a scholar has access to an archive or a text. For example, a native scholar, right? A native scholar in Sikkim would have a lot of difficulty in accessing an archive, rather than, let's say, a scholar visiting from the States or scholars coming from elsewhere had easy access to documentation. So how would you place the whole sort of interactive thing in archives, as some sort of an equal space?
Yeah, I mean, there are some remarkable examples even here in the Northeast. There's the Institute for Karbi Studies in Karbi Anglong in Assam, and Dharam Singh Taron is a community scholar who has made it his life's work to become the community scholar and develop an archive and develop a center in the community himself. I know him. I haven't visited him since he set up that center. I'm going to visit on my way back to Shillong from Kohima in a couple of weeks. But yeah, these are also issues of not just economic inequality, but academic inequality. Again, privileging. You have to have the credentials to have the access. Now, also, making an effort to have more indigenous community members going on to higher education and getting the professional credentials is also an important step. But somehow this recognition, or somehow the work that he did, as an example, in building an institute within his community without an academic structure over him, is an example, and that kind of example can be learned from. I'm also fascinated by people that set up their own museums. I don't know if any of you have been to, there's the Kohima War Museum, that a private individual just started collecting artifacts from the Battle of Kohima in World War II and has set up his own idiosyncratic, unique museum in Kohima village outside of Kohima city. So it can be done, but the organizing piece is what's going to make it possible to replicate that and to start the same kind of local movements in different places. And then it's a question of how do you knock on the door and get the access to the archive without having the kind of restrictions that exist. I mean, obviously some of the restrictions in terms of the safety of the artifacts and, you know, handling paper and making sure that things don't get stolen, although scholars steal from archives all the time too. I mean, that's part of the shame of the field. But you know, having certain kind of I don't want to say professional standards, but certain standards for usage, but that are not restricted based on credentials, but are that have a kind of uniform access regardless of your degree. I mean, this is all, as you can see, this is all very idealistic, and this is all a multi-year process, and we may see small gains, but it's not going to be, there's not going to be an overwhelming and overnight shift, unfortunately, but because it's all related to our economic and credential academic system. It all exists in that universe anyway, so.
So my question is regarding the village museum. So last year there was a glacial outburst in Sikkim, and there was a Richa museum in Zongu, which was entirely washed out. So that didn't came in papers, nothing. The researchers who knew about it, they talked about it, but other than that, no government, no nothing, no bureaucrats were affected by it. So what I feel is the geography, the location of the village museum also matters. And you say politics, visual community-based, everything. But that was a lecture community-based who took a lifelong to build it.
Wow.
But even the communities, I don't think so, whether they are concerned or not, I don't know. But I'm sorry to say this, but still date I haven't seen or saw people talking about it or seen an article written on it. So how do we meet these challenges again? In the village museum, we are trying to promote the village museum, but the village museum in these Himalayan area has environmental calamities and everything.
I mean, we are living in a world with tremendous inequality of resources, and this is where that really matters. I mean, I didn't hear about that, but that's an extraordinary case. That there weren't the resources when you're building your own museum or your own community museum, you don't have the resources necessarily to think about flood protection and durable materials in your architecture. You're making do. And maybe, the idea of a museum as something absolutely permanent is a kind of fiction too, because maybe, nothing lasts forever. Maybe everything is ephemeral to a degree. Look at Notre Dame Cathedral, look at what's the building in Denmark that just burned down? I'm forgetting the name, I should know this. I'm going to fail my exam. But, one of the most historic steeple in Copenhagen, and it burned down in a fire. So, just a couple weeks ago. But writing about that, memorializing that is a step, but this is a problem.
But just writing about it, is it enough?
No.
Because isn't that justice?
Nothing will bring it back.
Justice thing. So are we really doing some justice to it?
But again, the part of the digital revolution is you need time or you need resources, but everything can be photographed now. Everything can be digitized. It takes time. That's something that students can do. Students can do as volunteers. But it takes time. You obviously don't want to depend on volunteer labor. You want to be able to pay people for their time for that kind of thing. But the technology, some of the technology has gotten quite inexpensive to do that. But again, if you just have one or two people that are doing this as a pet lifelong project.
Another thing, there's a museum in Iraq. It's a private museum. So they have a lot of people and their coins and everything. So they till date I haven't heard they have done some digitization or something. So still the main problem is funding. So as you said, volunteers, 9 of them can't work TV because they have to attend your classes. Right. So how to go about these to help these private museums?
I mean,
we really want like to save it for the future. So what can be done?
This is also a challenge of neoliberalism too, right? That when everything is privatized, it puts it back on us, the people, to raise all the money to have the resources to do the work that needs to be done, rather than government or NGOs or some more less privatized institution recognizing the importance of that. You know, these cultural things, whether they're schools or museums, since the 1980s in particular, have been regarded as less important than money-making, business-oriented. I mean, that's just the way that market capitalism, the neoliberal iteration of market capitalism, has worked, particularly in the West, and I think to some extent here too, probably. I don't know as well, but I know that privatization in education is a big issue here now, right? So this is a problem, and this is a problem that we need to organize and try to push back. But it's pretty late in the game, and the forces that compel us to want to go out and make money rather than want to preserve our cultural heritage are very strong. And perhaps
I think we need to break down the entire definition of that so-called museum, the archive now. Yeah. So like how.
Yeah. I want everyone to hear that. Yeah.
So we need to break down the entire definition of the archive and the museum. So like if you say the Reda, like in this archival people, like article is like how we describe how the Greek word, like he mentions about how the word definition of the archive came in. The whole colonial concept. So he talks about the reconstruction of the thing. So right now I think in these, like if you really want to promote these village museums and the whole more like as you said, the interactive things, centers, then I think we have to do away with the Western notion of archive or definition, I do not and more like user-friendly, community-friendly.
Yeah.
So I think we should, like being like the research and everything, I think we should work towards that rather than like working with the existing norms. That's my view.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that, but another challenge though that I've heard from some of my friends who are Indigenous activists in their own community is, how do we get more people even in the community to care about this stuff? I mean, that's also, you know, I mentioned to you before, I have a friend in a community in Arunachal, and the young people are not learning the language because they just don't see a future in that. And he and his family and some other people are saying, no, our culture really matters, our practices really matter, our language really matters, but it's an uphill battle because the temptations to give that up and go learn Hindi or English are, you know, the economic rewards are there. And that's, yeah, I mean, perhaps artists have always been a minority, and cultural workers have always been a minority in their communities. It seems that the more people that I meet, the more interviews that I do throughout my work, that in every community there are people that regard the arts as absolutely essential, and then there are many other people that say that it's just entertainment. And how do we get that message out there that the arts are more than just a decoration, you know, that is really vital to our survival. Huge battle, but yeah.
I'm sorry, I think I'll be asking a question in a completely different strain.
Oh.
I'm sorry.
Last question.
Yeah. So as a student of undergraduate English, reading non-Christian literature, there is a motive of social censorship that can be found. Certain topics are issues that is rampant in the Northeast. For example, communal violence is very difficult to tackle and talk about. And before that oral history comes to archives and museums and interactive museums, it is difficult to get the conversation itself starting because of this not constrictively institutional, but even social censorship, which prevents these conversations from starting. So even in Eskimo's context, when we talk about tribes and we call Thor, these are social institutions which are difficult to talk of because they're related to social class standings and perceptions. And so in your work as in your life, have you ever come across similar situations of social censorship? And if yes, then how did you navigate those censorships to bring those conversations forward and bring about that oral history forward?
This was exactly, I think, what was so brilliant about the Cambodian Museum starting in Chicago, because the leaders in that community recognized that those conversations could not take place in Cambodia even 25, 30 years after the genocide. That it was only in a space, it was a refugee space, it was a space outside the community in a different country where people could have those conversations for the first time. So that's not an answer moving forward, but that's an example of people who were faced with that the leader, the Kompa, recognized that that the museum had to have a memorial, not just for the elders in Chicago, but for people who were visiting. And our visitors would say, there's no place like this in Cambodia where we can go and grieve. And you have hot ethnic conflicts that are taking place even here, even here and now. And so, for better or worse, distance in time and distance in space may be necessary to have those conversations in places where it can be safe, because there are, as we know in the world, in Gaza, journalists are not even safe to have that conversation right now, to have any conversation, to even point out what's going on, without getting, at best, banned and at worst, killed. It's not an ideal answer, but time, those conversations, the truth will come out, those conversations will come out over time, and they'll come out in places by journalists, by writers, by scholars who are not in the physical place where they're going to be in danger necessarily. In some cases, like dissidents from Russia, there is no safe space because they can be reached anywhere in the globe. But in most cases of like hot conflicts, you can't have it in the same space. It has to take place a little bit removed. But you lose the immediacy. You lose the immediacy. There are very few scholarly studies, for example, of, and this was one of the things that we were really aiming for with our exhibit on the people in prison. We were actually showing the artwork while they were still in prison. You have, I had another example that just flew out of my head. In the Second World War, when Japanese Americans were put in internment camps, concentration camps, by the U.S., there was actually a folklorist anthropologist who went into the camp and worked with one of the Japanese American poets and recorded oral folk poetry of the detainees and published it in the Journal of American Folklore while they were still detained, but at great personal risk to the people who are giving, narrative and giving voice. So as a researcher, you always have to remember that their safety is your number one. Much more important than anything else, like your career or knowledge or the future, anything like that, is keeping them safe. And if people want to take that risk themselves or are prepared to take that risk themselves, then honor that and respect it and do all you can to amplify it. But I think in reality, as much as we don't like it, these things come out later, after the fact, and in other locations, other locales. The one benefit that we hope for that, it's certainly our hope with the Cambodian Museum, is that this kind of knowledge can be used to prevent genocides in the future. We're not learning our lesson very well right now. Humanity keeps making these terrible mistakes. There was Rwanda and now Gaza, but education of the young, education about genocide, education about coexistence, we can draw on those materials of survivors and those materials of people who have thought about communication, coexistence, living together. And hopefully enough people will learn from that it will have an impact down the road. Thank you all for your time and attention and for great conversation, great questions.
Thank you, sir, and thank you everybody for all the really good questions that you all came with. So now I would like to call upon Ongju Lepcha. I'd like to call upon Ongju Lepcha for his vote of thanks.
Good afternoon all. So I stand here today as a proud and grateful student of Bahadur Bhandari Government College to express my heartfelt thanks to all those who have made this event possible. On behalf of the Northeast India Audiovisual Archive, I would like to thank Dr. William Westerman for traveling all the way to our college in order to share his knowledge and to interact with us. Thank you, sir. I would also like to express a heartfelt gratitude to our principal, Dr. D. Purohit, for his unwavering support. Thank you, sir. On behalf of the team, I would like to thank the HODs of Sociology, History, English Department, and other faculties members for their presence and support. I thank other distinguished guests for being with us today. I would also like to thank our students for participating in the lecture. So one last time, I would like to express my gratitude on behalf of the Northeast India Audiovisual Archive to making this third lecture series possible. Thank you. I now invite everyone for a group photo, please.